Okay, so the folks in Saltillo, when they come together after 1824 to draw up a state constitution, right? So the national constitution for Mexico was ratified in 1824, and then in Saltillo, there's going to be a state constitution that's going to be written. I think it's ratified in 1827. Don't get too fussed about these dates, but you should get a little bit fussed about the 1824 Constitution because it's very, very significant because it creates the state of Coahuila, Coahuila y Tejas with Saltillo at the capital. But anyway, so they come together in Saltillo to write a state constitution. And there's a lot of pressure in Saltillo. Anglos are already talking about if Saltillo doesn't approve slavery, there's going to be a revolt. The pro-slavery faction in Saltillo is saying, look, you have to allow slavery in Texas because Texas won't, it's a very poor, traditionally had been a backwater, very poor. Finally, we have a chance to make Texas a very wealthy province, which will spill over into places like Saltillo, but it won't become wealthy unless you allow slaves into Texas because it's the enslaved that do the cultivation of cotton. And so the legislature in Saltillo comes under intense pressure as they're writing up the state constitution to decide to favor slavery. So there's two factions. There's a pro-slavery faction in Saltillo, which is pretty powerful, really based on economics, the desire to see that Texas becomes part of the larger global cotton economy. And then the anti-slavery coalition, which is also quite powerful, that just has principled objections to the evils of slavery. And it is funny, I think I might have mentioned this before. It's worth saying twice, though. Um, Mexico never gets any credit for being anti-slavery. Um, they never get any good press for being anti-slavery. But anyway, that's another story. So what happened is the in the state constitution written for Coahuila, you had an Article 13. Okay, super technical. I know it's really detailed, but there was an article that dealt with slavery specifically. And here's what that article said. And go ahead and be kind of aware of what initially was the decision about slavery coming from Saltillo. It allowed the American settlers to keep their slaves. So if you had a slave in Texas, you could keep it. They were not going to free the slaves. There was a 6 month window also where Americans, Anglos who had come into Texas could purchase new slaves. So you had 6 months to purchase new slaves and bring them into Mexican Texas. But, and this is really the key, any children of slaves that were living in Texas would be freed. So after the Constitution was ratified, the children of slaves would ultimately be freed. They would not be slaves for life like their parents were. And so if you were a slave couple in Texas before Article 13 was ratified, your child would become free when the child was 21 or something like that. Okay. If you're a slave couple in Texas and you have a child after the Constitution was ratified, the child was born free. The child would be born free. So again, before the Constitution, if you had a child, the child wouldn't be freed until the child was about 21, but they would gain their freedom. After the Constitution was ratified, the child would be born a free person. The child would never be a slave. And what this meant is that there was a window that slavery would not exist in Texas forever because the children of slaves, either sooner or later, would ultimately become free. And so it didn't immediately abolish slavery, this Article 13 in the new state constitution. What it did is it would kill slavery in Texas over time. That slavery would die a fairly slow death, but that the end would come. That because the children would, like I said, they'd either be born free or if the child had already been born before the Constitution was ratified, the child would become free when he or she became an adult. Well, this absolutely blew the mind of Anglo settlers in Texas. They were horrified by this new constitution, and also the news got back to the United States. This actually stopped a lot of Americans from coming into Mexican Texas because they didn't want to risk their slaves. As I've talked about, slaves were worth tens of thousands of dollars. So the anti-slavery feeling in Mexico really actually slows down the entrance of Anglos into Texas. So this is for the pro-slavery faction. This is a five alarm fire, and they immediately work to subvert this Article 13, in which the children of slaves would be freed either sooner or later. So here's what they did. It's very diabolical, but it's clever, but it's diabolical. And so Austin and his allies in Saltillo, they slip a piece of legislation into the laws of Saltillo. And what they did was they had slaves that came into Texas declared as apprentice labor. Okay. So what apprentice labor is that you're a person that works for somebody for a set period of years. Usually it would be 7 years. And you might have run into this in your first half of US history at some point. A lot of folks came over from England as apprentices, where they'd work for a short time. Uh, uh, to somebody who would take care of them. And then after a certain amount of years, they would gain their freedom. But here was the deal. Here was the deal with what Austin slipped, this loophole that he slipped into the law of Saltillo. So basically, what Americans could do that wanted to bring their slaves into Texas. So let's say you're in Louisiana. This is what the new law allowed. You could take your enslaved, and of course, when I'm talking about slave, I'm talking about a human being. Let's not forget that. You could take, I guess I'll use the word captive. You could take your captive to a judge, and you in Louisiana, and you could declare that slave, that captive, as your apprentice, and that they would be your apprentice, but they would either be your apprentice for 99 years, or the slave would have to pay you back for the support that you gave the slave in terms of housing and food. So what happened is slaves coming into Texas, they came into Texas as apprentices. They did not come into Texas as slaves, right? But it didn't make any difference because you basically were under the same condition. Because if you came into Texas as an apprentice, but you were going to be an apprentice for 99 years, you're basically a slave for life. Or if you came into Texas and you had to pay back your owner for the support, and I'm putting support in quotes, that he gave you in terms of housing. And when I say housing, I'm talking about shacks, very, very rudimentary shelter and food. You were in a situation where you could never pay back your owner. So this was the loophole that Stephen F. Austin and his Tejano allies and his allies Saltillo slipped into the law of Coahuila y Tejas and Saltillo, that folks that were slaves in the United States would come into Mexican Texas not as slaves, but as apprentices. But their apprenticeship would basically last their entire life. And this apprenticeship system also caught up the children because, okay, so the slave comes in, they're classified as an apprentice, but how it caught up slave children is the minute the children was born, a child would be born, the owner would be feeding the child, would be offering some rudimentary shelter to the child, and that child would have to pay back the owner, but slaves weren't paid. So it was a situation where the children of these apprentices, i.e., slaves, would also be apprentices their whole life because they were in so much debt they could never pay back their owner. So what Austin did and his allies, they created a new system of slavery. It was exactly the same as the slavery in the United States. It was just called something different. You were called an apprentice, not a slave. But from the point of view of the captive, who is being forced into Texas against his or her will, there's absolutely no difference. You have no rights. You have to do what your master says. Your child is caught up in the system as well. So this is how Austin and his Tejano and his Saltillo allies, this is how they got around the anti-slavery provisions of Article 13 of the Constitution of Coahuila y Tejas that was ratified in 1827. They created this apprenticeship loophole that recreated slavery in Mexican Texas by another name, right? You were called an apprentice, but essentially you were a slave. So in the short term, this solved the problem that Austin and other Anglos had because, again, it was a deal breaker for them. There had to be slavery in Texas, or there couldn't be cotton production. And I know I've said it 10 times, and you're probably sick of hearing about it, but you just can't untie or unlink slavery from cotton production. They were one in the same. They were one in the same. It was the enslaved who cultivated the cotton. And for Austin and the Anglos that were coming into Texas, slavery was absolutely essential to the economy that they wanted to become part of, the cotton economy that was generating so much wealth.